the professors that I had, at least several professors that I had at Michigan State, had studied under Harvey Mansfield, who, as some of you may know, is a Straussian himself. And one thing that I've heard about Straussians, and this is actually, I believe, I'm quoting from Harvey Mansfield himself, was that there are Straussians, but there is no such thing as Straussianism. And so there's this distinction between sort of the followers of the man, Leo Strauss, and what you might call something like a derivative ideological position. So, for example, there are, in contrast, there are Marxists, right? And then there's Marxianism. And those are often one and the same. Whereas Mansfield is stating there that it's not necessarily the case with Leo Strauss. And I know that you personally had an interest in Leo Strauss pretty early on in your career, and have found yourself separating off or breaking away from what you would call sort of the traditional Straussians. How would you describe yourself? Would you describe yourself as a Straussian? And as an add-on to that, do you think that there is there some core difference between yourself, your view of Strauss, and these sort of more established Straussian scholars?
Yeah, so there are nuances among the Straussians, among the various schools, and still, I think I can say something general and something on the basis of my own experience here. So first, let me just take a step back and say that I didn't discover Strauss through through an explicit Straussian lineage. So some people, they have professors that they know are Straussians. The professors assign Strauss, and it's kind of like an official, explicit induction into Strauss's way of thinking. So I know people like that. There were people at the University of Toronto, for example, who knew they were studying with the Straussian. They knew that they were going to be reading Strauss. They knew that that's what was happening to them. In my case, that wasn't at all what happened. I did have a first-year philosophy professor who was amazing. The class was incredible. It was better than any other class by an immeasurable distance. And when I later in life reverse engineered what made that class so good, it was because I had discovered that the people he assigned, the people whose translations he assigned, were students of Strauss. So Strauss was never mentioned in the class. And esoteric writing and these other themes, they were never mentioned. But we read Harvey Mansfield's translation of The Prince. We read Alan Bloom's translation of The Republic. And his approach to the introduction of philosophy was not contemporary. It was sort of classical. And somehow, when I later in life read these names and saw that they were all related to Strauss, I pieced together, oh, okay, that's the theme. Like, that's all that I have to grasp onto about what made that class so amazing, what made that professor so outstanding. And that's where I threw myself into Strauss personally, into whatever I could read of his. And it was like I had discovered forbidden literature in the Soviet Union or something like that, because I was really eating it up in an environment that was not Straussian. The University of British Columbia was anti-Straussian, the Department of Philosophy. And all of the people around me were anti-Straussian. I had professors at the time say to me, Strauss, that guy scares me. Strauss, don't read him. Find somebody more middle of the road. You know, the professors who found out that I was interested in Strauss were discouraging me from reading him. So I threw myself into him, and I thought that he was able to identify very clearly the bankruptcy, the nature of the bankruptcy of the discipline of political science. Now, it's not that it does nothing good, but his assessment of it at times was really scathing. So in this work called Epilogue, which you can find in English in Liberalism, Ancient and Modern, one of the chapters, he ends it by saying that the contemporary political scientists or social scientists, they fiddle while Rome burns, but they don't know that they fiddle, and they don't know that it's burning. In other words, they're just operating totally cluelessly about the meaning of political science, about their own understanding of political life. So I wasn't brought up in an official Straussian environment in that sense. And what I thought, and what is most important about Strauss to me, it has changed a little bit over the years, but it's two things. It's what I say is his philosophical supremacy, which means that the philosophical life of the philosopher, the way of life of the search for wisdom, is the standard. It's the peak. It's it's what sets everything in its right perspective and in its right place. The life of the philosopher. And you could say the person of Socrates if you need a quick stand-in. But really the act of philosophizing is the peak. But at the same time, what Strauss always emphasizes, and this came out in the pro seminar if you had a chance to listen to it, or if anybody who's watching or hearing this will get a chance to listen to it, Justin Murphy's pro seminar from the course. What Strauss does so marvelously and importantly for us is combine philosophical supremacy, or the life that sees the search for wisdom as the best and greatest good, with moderation, or with the needs of the political community, with a civic responsibility, with well ordered and well measured speech and writing. So he's not so insane like some philosophical supremacists are, that he's willing to leave a trail of destruction in his wake or something like that. And at the same time, he's not so tepid in his moderation that he's lost all spark of erotic intellectual energy and life. You know, that he's dimmed the light so much that there's nothing there, nothing left, which some defenders of moderation do. He's able to preserve that tension. He lives right in the space that's carved out by dedication to wisdom and a sense of the need for moderation. And in fact, I would say that carves out for him the meaning of political philosophy as such. It's that combination between the genuinely immoderate, drunken, insane, but incredible and good philosophical spark with everything that's required by the city, the cave, moderation, speech, living with others, justice, morality, and all of that. Now, why do I say all of that as a background to answering your question? So, when I studied at the University of Toronto graduate program of political science, there was a self-described Straussian there. This would have been my first exposure in academia, not just through their writings, but through their manner of like instruction in the classroom and demeanor and everything else like that, right? Where you have to put your money where your mouth is, to a self-professed Straussian. And in my own case, this was somebody who, over the case of Dugin, actually was completely betraying the principles of Straussianism as I understand them. So that was shocking to me. You see that the one explicitly self-professed Straussian, who has relationships with many other well-known self-professed Straussians, behaved over the case of a strange philosopher, namely this Russian guy, Alexander Dugin. He behaved with respect to him in a way that was completely I want to put it accurately and politely and not drag the guy too badly, but basically, I thought it was a total disgrace, not just personally, but again, it seemed like the opposite of Strauss's teaching as I had come to understand it. You know, because let me give you a brief example, because I think this is valuable. Strauss has this 1941, I think, or 1940 talk called German Nihilism, which I taught in the course, we discussed in the course. It's an amazing thing to read, German Nihilism. And one of the things that Strauss says there is that these young nihilists in Germany who didn't want to accept the liberalism of Weimar Republic and were totally disgusted by the leftist alternative to that, but didn't have a positive program to offer that wasn't either liberal or leftist, they gave a resounding no to the alternatives, rejected them, and were left with sort of nothing to put in their place besides the destruction of civilization. And he says that they were failed by their teachers. They were failed by their progressive teachers. This is what Strauss says in that talk, who failed to recognize the positive significance of their passionate moral protest against equality, freedom, entertainment, the rights of man. In other words, they were looking for something more dignified, more noble, with more depth, more substance. And Strauss even says that they we're not alone in doing that, because the protest against moral degradation is shared by Rousseau, Nietzsche, Plato, in other words, by these outstanding thinkers in the history of political philosophy. But the professors didn't get any of that. They did not understand the positive significance of the students' moral protest. All they gave them back were progressivist platitudes, and they pushed the students further into unofficial channels or into the arms of the more radical thinkers of that era, the ones who, quote, knowingly or unknowingly paved the way for Hitler, as Strauss puts it. So what does it mean? It means that he blames ultimately the ham-handedness, insensitivity, and progressivism of the teachers for the faults, as they were, of the political faults of the students. So I have a concern that some contemporary Straussians totally do the same thing. They don't learn Strauss's lesson when it comes to this murky middle ground of contemporary, quote unquote, German nihilism. They see themselves as erring so much on the side of moderation that they really fail to speak to the students who want to say no to liberalism and no to communism, and who don't have a clear alternative to put up there. So what do those students do who could be given some guidance and some direction that gives them a genuine alternative to these, like a genuine way of thinking through their moral protest to the status quo? Well, those students just they do now, like they did then to a certain extent, go to unofficial, sources who may not be the best guides to these type of issues and these types of questions. So that is a big criticism that I have against contemporary Straussians. If they've lost the spark that for Strauss you see from the first words he ever put on paper to the last words he ever put on paper, then they just are doing a dishonor to his legacy.
That's a great example there with that paper, German Nihilism. I see a lot of parallels between the situation that you're describing, and I don't like to do this because people want to compare our situation to Weimar Germany so often that it's become sort of a trite thing to do. But I see a lot of parallels, at least in terms of the thought patterns between what you're describing is this sort of failure of these Straussians to properly hold the tension between philosophy and the city, and a lot of what's happening currently in terms of real vigorous, productive, interesting academics such as yourself being either marginalized or relegated or kicked out altogether from a sort of traditional academic life due to the various dogmas and factional disputes and things like that are popular today.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very hard not to, I don't want to make this about your personal story.
Yeah,
but
no, let me just say, so when we did the course,
mm-hmm.
we started with this contemporaneous 1940 or 1941, a set of remarks of Strauss's called Living Issues of German Post-War Philosophy. Okay, so it's about the same time as the German nihilism essay. It hits some of the same themes. Those were the first two readings that we did in the course, weeks 1 and 2, because they showed the similarity of the situation that he was facing and the situation that we're facing. And there are a couple of really amazing parallels from the Living Issues essay as well. For example, Strauss says that the most important thinkers at the time were not the academics in the universities. They were just continuing on with the old patterns. They hadn't grasped the novelty of the situation. They hadn't penetrated to its depth. So he says that explicitly right at the beginning, that you had the academic philosophers and then you had sort of like the genuine thinkers, and that's where all the action was. Now, I don't mean to imply that everybody who's an ex-academic or a former academic, is a mover and a shaker in today's intellectual environment, but I mean something about the fact that the most interesting currents of thought are not in the university, which is too constrained to be dealing with them, I think still resonates. And then when Strauss looked at what were those movements of thought, so he looked, for example, at Spengler's cultural relativism and Weber's social science positivism. It's amazing because right on page 1 or page 2 of the remarks, maybe page 3, but not further than that, he says, Spengler had treated even, mathematics as like a cultural phenomenon, so that you have like exactly what, if you do any sort
being
of
revivified today.
Pardon me?
I said that's being revivified
Yeah,
today.
exactly. So what we have today, in some sense, is a very pale imitation of the very serious debates that were happening then. And one of the reasons why it's helpful to read Strauss is because we can elevate our understanding of what's going on now by linking the pale imitation to its serious exposition. And then by having an extremely competent guide walk us through the serious level, where we're not comparing, somebody who tweeted 2 + 2 = 5. We're comparing the meaning of Spengler's cultural relativism, how it leads us to the analysis of old texts, why Weber's positivism does not, sort us out, Spinoza's apparent refutation of the possibility of miracles, the return to political theology in Schmidt. It's like, that's the real stuff right there. That's where it's happening at the level of those serious thinkers. So, I mean, one reason we couldn't compare today to Weimar through and through is because students there had recourse to people like Heidegger, who were alive and writing at the time. We don't have recourse to people like Heidegger alive and writing at the time because we don't quite have that level of intellectual depth and penetration quite as represented as it was then, where you can have, like I say, Schmidt, Rosenzweig, Heidegger, this school, this giant, that giant, all of them trying to get to the bottom of these big questions. One other thing I just want to say briefly, like I mentioned in the class, Strauss says, people who recognize that we seem to have entered a time that reflects the crisis of rationalism, the crisis of reason, that we no longer have a rational account of the ends of a good human life, that somehow reason seems like it's become inadequate as a tool for guiding a meaningful human life. So he says in this situation, one of the alternatives that people had open to them, well, besides like the appeal to authority, the authority of the state or the authority of God in political theology, besides the appeal to cultural relativism or to social science, some of them tried to recover a form of rationalism, like natural law, 17th and 18th century natural law thinking, or Catholic Aristotelianism, right? Scholasticism, Aquinas. And he says all of these movements suffered from the fact that they all were somehow derivative from the basic intellectual sources from Plato and Aristotle in a way that they'd never made sufficiently clear to themselves. So Strauss, he looks at everything going on. The Catholic reactionary thought, okay, not reactionary, the Thomism, the relativism, the nihilism. And he says, we don't have, we can see everything that's going on, but we don't have the wherewithal to think it through well unless we go back to the source of our tradition newly and try to understand where we misread something, where we misunderstood something, where we made a false step. And it's amazing. I mean, people in the class, whether they were seeing Strauss for the first time, everybody is alive in the 21st century, looks around them, has their own impression of where we find ourselves. And everybody seems to have regarded Strauss's treatment as super valuable in giving us points of reference that are not just superficial, that are deeper and more insightful than what we're used to.